Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rethinking Porn Addiction. We're two people short this week. It's kind of sad,
Yeah.
but the show must go on. So we're missing Doug and we're missing Jake. Both had some last-minute scheduling conflicts and things that they had to take care of, but we decided we were going to jump on and do a show for you, and mostly because I think especially Hans and I are really excited about this specific topic. So I've been thinking for probably about at least a week about how to introduce this topic.
Nice.
And I want to share. Okay, so there's a reason I want to share to start it off this way, because in my experience researching the topic of pornography and people who struggle with pornography, and just all these conversations that we've been having, the books that I've read, the trainings that I've been to, one of the outlying factors that I've noticed along the way, and therapist Kristen can maybe back me up on this, but this idea of porn addiction or having an out of control pornography problem almost always stems from people who have a highly religious or conservative background. There's the overlap of out of control sexual behaviors, urges, and desires overlaps a lot with being religious. And and we haven't spent much time talking about religion or our faith or our beliefs. And I started thinking about the topic for this week, and my mind went over and over and over again to the story of Jesus. And in the theology of Christianity, Jesus represents the ultimate ideal.
Yeah.
He is the very best that any of us could ever even hope to be. It's who we aspire to be, like Christ in Christianity. And the reason the story of Christ is so compelling is because he was so good and so perfect. And then despite the goodness and the perfection, he was betrayed. He was wrongfully accused of committing crimes. He was whipped and tortured. He was forced to wear a crown of thorns, and he was forced to carry his cross through the streets, and then was hung to that cross and stabbed and offered vinegar in place of water and mocked and spit on, and reviled. And ultimately, the most good person was essentially took on the suffering of the world. And that's not to mention the spiritual suffering in the theology of Christianity that he endured. So he endured all the physical stuff, and on top of that took on the sins and afflictions of the world. So I started thinking about that, and this term that kept popping up in my head was the invitation to bear our cross, or take the cross upon us in our lives. And from my understanding of the way I was raised, the cross that you're supposed to bear as a Christian is the inherent suffering in life. Like, life is not fair. Just like Christ's life was not fair, he experienced immense amounts of undeserved suffering. Our life isn't fair, and we come in. We have to meet head on the suffering in our lives. And the reason that the story of Christ is so compelling is not because he suffered, but because he overcame the suffering. The reason that the story of Christ is so meaningful is not because he was killed, but because he overcame death. It wasn't because he suffered for the sins of the world, but that he overcame those sins, and therefore offering humanity a chance to be saved. The beauty in the suffering and the beauty in the story, and the reason it lasts, is because Christ was able to endure and transcend the suffering. And I kept thinking about the religious aspect of how the struggles of pornography are oftentimes intertwined with religion, and yet how the religion that seems to be most closely connected with this hopelessness, this pornography problem, this sense of worthlessness or abandonment or loneliness, shame, is also connected with this story of somebody finding profound or creating profound meaning by through their suffering. And so the topic that I think that we should talk about this week is, how do we find meaning and purpose in the crisis or the conflict or the struggle or the suffering of a pornography problem? So that's, I know I kind of went off in a direction that probably neither of you were prepared for or expecting, but that story has just been replaying itself in my mind, and I wanted to kind of explore it with you guys and see how this story of Christ kind of creating meaning from his suffering can also be mirrored in our lives, where we can find meaning in our suffering.
I think it's awesome, Nate. And as you were talking, I was experiencing, having internal feelings of curiosity and excitement and nervousness and some anxiety. And I think that made me just anxiety around the idea of exploring what is a really sacred topic, I guess, to myself. And I like the idea of poking into those corners. We've talked a lot about being curious here and figuring out, exploring the boundaries and exploring our anxieties and concern. So for that reason, I'm really excited about the conversation. And also I'm a bit nervous to see what comes out of it.
Can I ask you how it's like, where's the nervousness come in?
Yeah, I would say nervousness comes in because I don't, this topic and this conversation is, or things of this nature, like trying to figure out my life experience and how that makes sense in my own personal faith belief system also, is something that I spend a lot of time on. Mm-hmm. And in this particular conversation about how does pornography or sexual imagery or that crisis and that struggle, how does that relate to my faith? I often see them in conflict with each other. I often see them as a conflicting pair, perhaps. And so, Nate, that's why I think I felt a little bit of anxiety or nervousness, is blending them into, how do I get value and how do I religiously maybe even benefit from what I'm going through or what I've gone through, is a curious space for me to explore. Not one. Is it okay with you guys?
Is it okay with you guys if we have a more religious conversation today?
I'm totally great with that. I think it's a topic that we have kind of touched on a couple times, and I know at times we've even talked about what you said earlier. And Doug has shared the research with regard to pornography and addiction, out of control sexual behavior, that it is predominantly cisgender, male, conservative, religious background that is where this problem manifests itself. So I think it's very much intertwined with my own personal belief, and would love to really explore that.
So I want to start off by commenting on something that you just said a minute ago that was really interesting about the juxtaposition of sexual imagery and your religious beliefs, and how they don't play nice together. And so they give you a little bit of anxiety, which I totally get. So I guess my question was that a way of saying, like, looking at sexual imagery or pornography is sinful, and the sinfulness of looking at those images doesn't jive well with the moral structure of your religious upbringing?
Yeah, I think so. What came to mind really particularly for me, I felt a little bit of dissonance or a little bit of nervousness in comparing myself in any way, shape, or form with the life of Christ and his being and his existence.
Interesting.
And the idea of him, Christ, suffering and he experiencing that for a reason and a purpose and incredible meaning behind that, and then trying to put that or frame that my own experiences in that same manner in some way. It was uncomfortable for me, or it is uncomfortable for me to think about. And at the same time, I have spent a lot of time in my life thinking about the most difficult things that I've gone through, and how they have very much resulted in the largest periods of growth and spiritual maturation, faith growing instances have been out of the deepest, darkest moments in my life. And so I very much like to think about what they mean, why we experience those, and why we have the difficult challenges, physical, emotional, or spiritual in life that we all struggle with.
Huh.
So I don't know if this is where you wanted to go the conversation, Nate, but I've got
no intentions. So
no intention. Just as a thought that occurred to me as you were leading into the conversation. I've got a really good friend who grew up in the LDS community also. At a young age, had some experiences around gender dysphoria that were confusing to him, and then put it away and didn't deal with that for a long time in his life. And recently, over the past few years, has started to move into and try to understand, find comfort, find understanding in the gender dysphoria feelings that he has. And he said something incredibly enlightening to me at one point. What he's come to realize is he has not grown closer to Christ and our heavenly parents by getting rid of the confusion and the difficulty and the struggle that he has related to gender dysphoria. Those troubles and difficulties and struggles that he has is exactly the thing that has brought him closer to Christ and closer to his heavenly parents and has caused him to grow spiritually. And as I'm saying that, I feel like that I feel some dissonance between what I'm expressing in that and the idea of the use of sexual imagery or pornography. So maybe there's not a apt comparison there.
Hold up, because I do think there is.
Okay, go.
I'll just throw it out here just to say, because I'm thinking the struggles of connecting your sexuality, your desires within your religious and belief system.
Yeah.
The possible solution isn't ridding yourself of the desires, ridding yourself of this, but through the struggle, it is drawing you closer to find different kinds of meaning and to understand it differently. And therein lies the work, because I see a lot of men that struggle with their sexual imagery, but deeper than that, they struggle with their desires. They struggle with what they want and how they experience it and how they express it. So initially their solution is to have an erotic ectomy, like just anything that will cut off my desire because it's causing such great internal distress, to come to find out that this very struggle they're having with their sexuality is causing them to dig deeper and to connect more deeply than they ever had, expanding their spirituality. I don't know if that's the same, but I feel like the underlying principle is it's not necessarily to rid ourselves, to suppress, to cut off, to eliminate, but to lean into it and find, to have to wrestle. Like if we're going religious, a key component was Christ having to wrestle. And there was a time when he's like, can this be taken from me? Like, take that as an option. But the wrestling, and I know like in Gethsemane, and there's a lot of doctrines that view that moment differently, but there's a lot of wrestling. And I guess for me, that's the great invitation of Christ, is to deepen the understanding to that what you see at first glance, there's a lot of other ways to look at it, which is what I think he did beautifully with the parables of, you're all seeing it in this way, but let me invite you to dig deeper and to look at it possibly from another way.
You know, I'm hearing you guys talk. I just have this, I've been having this mental image about the way the way that Jesus lived, if you go back and read the New Testament, he's notoriously like basically the embodiment of God in human form. And he's proclaimed to be perfect. He set the perfect example for us. And it's really interesting to me that, how do I put this? I think for me, I'll just speak from my own personal experience, that this idea of perfection has been kind of like hovering over my head for a really long time, because the idea of trying to be more Christ-like or following Christ's footsteps felt like immense pressure to me. And I felt like the only way to do it would be to basically cut myself off from anything that might lead me to sin. Yeah. And what I started to think about as you guys were talking is Christ wasn't sinless because he locked himself in a box to avoid any sort of temptation or exposure to evil or interaction with something that might be harmful to him or that might entice him to do something bad. He was a force for good. He was, I don't want to say homeless, but he spent much of his life, especially in his ministry, on the road, traveling from place to place, spending time with people, especially with people who were suffering and struggling. Like, he was just always out doing things. And I just had this kind of switch flip for me that maybe part of the invitation of Christ isn't to be sinless by avoiding sin at all costs. Maybe it's to willingly pick up the cross and stare into the abyss, stare into the unknown, the uncertainty of suffering, and wrestle with that. Like what Kristen was saying, like there is a sense of like, wow, can this be taken from me? But there's a willingness to go into the unknown and wrestle with it and come out on the other side and overcome that suffering. And so there's this kind of juxtaposition of, if I'm going to be righteous, if I'm going to be worthy, do I need to be pure? Because pure to me is like that white room, the white padded room where there's nothing evil or bad in proximity, and like, oh, okay, we're safe here because there's nothing that can hurt us. There's nothing bad. Or is the real invitation to get out into the world and to confront the chaos and the scariness of it, and to confront the darkness in ourselves or the things that make us uncomfortable, and to deal with it head on and create meaning out of it by outgrowing our problems. And the older I get and the more life experience I get, I think it's more the latter than the former. And I think I suffered a lot in my life unnecessarily growing up because I felt so much pressure to just avoid sin. And that was what Christ wanted me to do. That's what people expected me to do, is to be perfect and to not make mistakes and not sin. But that turned me into a coward. It turned me into somebody who was afraid to do anything. I was afraid to fail. I was afraid to take risks. I was afraid to be honest about who I was and what I struggled with. But I think you only truly become like Christ when you do what he did, which is to willingly take on the burden of suffering and overcome it. And those are two very different motifs.
So what does that look like? What does it look like? Hans, you brought in a story that you had made a connection somewhere. And as you talked out loud, you're like, I'm not sure if this fits, but I think it did. And then Nate, you're talking about suffering and maybe looking right into it. What does that look like with your sexuality? What does that look like with sexual imagery? What does that look like with masturbation? What does that look like? Let's
get down to brass tacks. Yeah.
I want to say two things.
Yeah.
First, I want to put a pin in something you just said, Nate. You used the word sin a couple of times.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in going to that conversation about, is sexual desire sin, and what does that spectrum or space look like?
Yeah.
Before we go there, though, I want to go back to, and this was something that's very personal to me and important to me, and I want to say it out loud so the listeners hear, and I'm curious if you guys also feel this way. When I think about Christ's life, like you talked about, Nate, him not locking himself and shunning anything that had any appearance of evil. He was very often with the poor, destitute, sinners, outcasts, people that society shunned were the people that he connected deeply with. My own personal meditations on that is because Christ knew himself so well. Like, he developed an understanding of who he was, that he was wholly comfortable with that and can operate just from his divine being and his divinity, and was able to lead a sinless life because of that. And that's something that I've really worked at myself, of, if I really intimately get to know who I am, then how does that change my behavior? And one of the things that I recognize that in kind of deconstructing and then reconstructing my own personal faith system is that at first, the teachings of specifically the Mormon Church, and I believe other conservative religions are the same, sexual desire and sexual impulse is evil and looked at in a fashion of, that is sin, stay away from it. And when I was able to move into a space where I finally understood that my sexual desire is a part of me, that is me, I am a sexual being, that was a huge step in my own personal process of starting to reconcile how does sexual desire, how does my sexual being come to peace and work together with my faith being. And so I guess I just wanted to say that was really important for me. And I'm curious if you guys can say concretely or have that experience also of, where do you, maybe just let me just ask the question. How do you view your sexual being as part of yourself? Is it, I'm just going to ask that. How do you view your sexual being as part of yourself?
When I think about my journey with the intersecting, like my religious beliefs and my sexuality over the last couple of decades, I noticed that when I was the most insecure or scared of my own sexuality is when I had the most judgment and hatred towards those that kind of, I was more judgmental and more anxious around people who lived a different type of sexual life than I did.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
And so I feel like the more comfortable I've become with my own sexuality, the more comfortable I've become with other people who deal with others' struggles in the realm of sexuality. And I feel like that what you were saying about Jesus being able to go spend time with people who were complete outcasts in society, because he knew who he was and he was comfortable with exactly who he was. He understood his humanity, if you want to call it that, in a sense, and was clear on what his purpose was. I don't think you could have paid me any sum of money in my like teens and 20s, much of my 20s, to like go hang out with a sex worker.
Yeah.
Or to I remember serving a mission and being deeply uncomfortable when my mission companion invited me to hug a gay man.
Yeah.
It made me very uncomfortable. Like, it was something outside of what I was familiar with. And I had so much sexual shame on myself that there's no space for compassion for others.
Yeah.
If I couldn't have compassion for my own sexuality and my own sexual identity, in a sense, my own sexual being, if I couldn't integrate that in myself, how could I be loving or accepting of somebody else who fell outside that scope? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's great to me. Yeah.
So I've at least found that as I've been able to integrate my sexuality more into my life and become more at peace with my own struggles and my own shame, and allowing myself to be a sexual being and to own my desires and to kind of navigate this complex and turbulent water, and maybe even question some of the things I was taught and raised with, and come out with a more appropriate and holistic perspective, that not only do I feel more compassion and peace towards myself, but outwardly towards other people, there's so much less stress and anxiety and judgment and condemnation and cruelty and unkindness. Like, that stuff has gone away and been replaced with what I would call like a Christ-like love and compassion. So
I love how you just said that, Nate. I've experienced that also. As I've recognized my own humanity in areas, whether it's sexuality or other places, as I've been willing to accept myself and what I feel in those areas, it has immensely enlarged my ability to be compassionate and to accept people where they are, how they are, whatever space they might be in. And I think that's a beautiful, maybe that's one of the beauties and the meanings of going through these sexual crises.
And this kind of ties into what Kristen was asking a minute ago. So I was looking over some of the questions that we've been asked over the last couple of months that have been submitted by our listeners. If you guys are watching or listening in our Facebook group, there's a form that you can fill out to submit anonymous questions. And so many of those questions revolve around like, how can I disassociate myself from my partner's struggles with pornography? How do I not make it about me? You know, I don't want to feel uncomfortable with I want to feel more comfortable with my feelings towards my husband's porn use. I feel hesitant initiating sex because I don't want to like tell my partner that it's okay. And there's stuff on the flip side on the person who's using pornography, who feels guilt and shame and withdraws. And so it's like, to go back to Kristen's question, what does it look like to go into we'll call it a pornography crisis, where as a couple or as an individual, you're dealing with this unwanted, you're acting out in ways that conflict with your values. How do you flip that from something that makes you miserable and maybe feel like everything's meaningless or you're unlovable or whatever, and feel like there's no hope? And how do you flip that and turn it into something meaningful? Like, how do you find meaning in a crisis like this?
I'm not sure if you can find meaning, but sometimes I feel like when you're in crisis, that's not when the meaning.
That's great. I'm glad you brought that up. Say more.
Well, I think it's in that moment when you're feeling flooded, you're feeling confused and heartbroken and betrayed and uncertain and worried and afraid that you could hold something out there of like, there's got to be some sort of meaning in this, or why is this happening? But it seems like once people get to the other side and they have more information or context, they are able to find meaning of what that was about. So I guess I just want to normalize that. What I see at times are clients that come in and want to navigate the crisis perfectly, even like, how do I dig deeper and find the meaning in the moment? And it's like, sometimes you're just getting through it. Like sometimes you're just surviving and feeling and being present for what is alive in you emotionally and relationally. And as you kind of decide like, yep, I want to be in this, or yep, I want to, like, then you start figuring it out. And when you get further away, you get a bit more perspective and we start to create meaning.
Yeah. And Chris, I want to point out that alone can be a gift that this crisis can give you, is the ability to say what you want and don't want, or the ability to express emotions that have gone unexpressed for a long time. I think a lot of time there's a mutual silence around the conversation of like pleasure or sexuality inside of a relationship, and a pornography problem can open up the door, albeit painfully, but at least open up the door to start having these conversations, which can be a gift in and of itself.
Yeah.
I totally echo that, Nate. I mean, we talked last time about discovery or disclosure and how does a porn crisis even come about? And the conversations that Cami and I have had since that first discovery, and the conversations we have are now way different than they were before, and we can be much more honest and vulnerable and sincere and curious about saying things and exploring things and asking questions. And so, it very much, in that sense, completely changed my sexual relationship with myself and with my partner.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking of, is for many in religious backgrounds, it's already their sexuality is already prescribed. There's not really curiosity. It's just, we've talked about sin. This is what is okay. This is what is appropriate. This is where your sexuality can land.
and that's just what you do. And I think sometimes a porn crisis can invite the developmental space that never got to occur, where you start to figure out who you are as a sexual being, because there wasn't a whole lot of space to do that when you were 12, 13, 15, 20. You just kind of needed to get to marriage, and then you could be a sexual being in some form.
I really like what you just said, Chris, about the developmental space never having been there. I've never thought about it in that concise language, but that is so true when I look back at my own personal development, growing up in a conservative religious setting. It was very much prescribed what the sexual being was supposed to, or was not supposed to look like, really, when I was all the way through adolescence, until I got old enough that I started having personal crises and faith crises and emotional crises and crises with my partner. And only then did I really step back far enough to be able to explore that developmental space and reconstruct it.
Yeah. So I am curious. I'm going to go back to a question, because I am curious. Do you think you need to inherently, like, is sex and pleasure and desire a sin, and is suffering necessary? Like when you say you've got to pick up your cross and get through, I am also hearing words that are interesting or intriguing to me of, self-compassion, tolerate, struggle. Is there a space for just sexual celebration and expression and all these other pieces? Or is sexuality inherently meant to be a struggle and we need to pick up our cross and do this thing? Like, I don't know if there's a clear question in there, but I'm hoping something pings on both of you.
Yeah. That's a great question, because I think there's two kinds of suffering. There's necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering. Necessary suffering is the suffering that we have to experience to grow. Like when you're riding a bike, sometimes if you want to master riding on that two-wheeler, you got to fall over a couple of times and you get a couple scrapes, but eventually you get it. And it's really hard to lock in that riding the bike without getting a couple of bumps and bruises along the way. It's some necessary suffering in order to earn the privilege of riding a bike. Unnecessary suffering is maybe taking off the training wheels before you're ready, or riding with a blindfold, sitting on the handlebars, riding backwards. Like, there's a lot of things you can do to hurt yourself to experience suffering completely unnecessarily that doesn't get you any sense of progress. And I think in life, there are many aspects of life where we put ourselves through unnecessary suffering. And I think this realm of sexuality is filled with some necessary suffering. And the necessary suffering, I would say, is like one of the things, Kristen, you talk about a lot, is becoming like the steward or the sex expert in your own life. Mm-hmm. And we talked about the sexual garden a couple of weeks ago, and looking at your garden objectively and deciding what you want to keep and what you want to get rid of is oftentimes a painful experience. It requires some suffering to uproot deeply held beliefs that you were maybe taught by religious leaders or by parents or by culture, and say, I don't want that anymore, at the risk of being judged by others or even condemned by others. Like, that experience requires you to willingly take on some sort of suffering, some sort of burden, emotional burden. And that's the type of suffering I would encourage people to lean into. But there's also unnecessary suffering in the realm of sexuality. And unnecessary suffering is like something, this is my opinion, my perspective. Hans, you can tell me what you think, but like keeping secrets from people, that's an unnecessary thing. Yeah. It might feel necessary, and it might feel really scary to be honest about your sexual choices with your partner that impact them. But eventually you're going to the truth comes out, and maybe starting by sharing with a close friend or finding a men's group or a women's group or whatever is a good place to start. But like keeping the secret is unnecessary suffering, and insisting on keeping that secret for years or decades and living with that torture when there are many ways where you can offload that burden and be honest and have integrity, that to me is unnecessary suffering. Unnecessary suffering is being angry or shutting other people down without like listening to their perspective, just to keep yourself feeling comfortable. Kristen, you mentioned I remember like the third or fourth episode we ever recorded, you said at one point in your porn experience with Jake, you had to ask yourself, do I want to know Jake for who he is, or do I want to know him only for who I need him to be in order for me to feel comfortable? And forcing Jake to be somebody he's not just so you can be comfortable is a type of unnecessary suffering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. What are your thoughts on that, Hans, before I jump in?
That I agree very much, Nate, about this. And when I think of suffering, I think when you talked about the necessary suffering versus the unnecessary suffering, a lot of that suffering for me, and it's going back to what I mentioned earlier, had to do with getting to know and accepting myself enough. And as long as I as long as I had this picture of myself that wasn't actually what myself was, there was suffering going on there. But once they started to come together and kind of became congruent, and I could kind of figure out, okay, this is who I am. I can take some deep breaths. I can come to peace with that. Then I could start, maybe that's the first time that you could actually start to alleviate some of the unnecessary suffering, because thinking back, I wouldn't have been able or wasn't willing to disclose secrets or talk about secrets until I got comfortable enough with who I was to be able to say, this is what I'm feeling. I want to share it with you, and let's figure out what it means.
So think out loud with me for a minute.
Yeah.
Because I keep having this pop up in my mind of suffering and growth. And to me, suffering possibly lends itself to a living, breathing thing, an animal, a human, whatever.
Yeah.
That has no ability to change their circumstances. They are suffering and they are dependent on something externally shifting that to put them out of their suffering or alleviate the suffering, something.
Yeah.
And then I think of growth. And when I think of growth isn't comfortable. And I keep hearing these themes of growth. And I'm wondering if there's mindset in the difference between suffering and growth of, this is really uncomfortable. And in order for me to evolve, to grow, to spiritually mature, to emotionally mature, to relationally mature, I am going to have to take a step. Suffering is possibly a belief that you can do nothing. You are where you are. And if someone points out, well, what if you did this? Or what if you tried that? Or if you look at it that way, you defend it and you're like, I can do nothing. I'm suffering. Like, I'm trying to think this out loud, but I keep hearing these themes of steps into growth, and that there are growing pains, but I don't know if I see that as necessarily suffering. Does that make sense? Like, suffering to me is a very helpless, you can do nothing, where growth is, you might suffer because you're just unwilling to do something. That's why I want to think this out loud with you.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, the words we use are important. So what does suffering mean?
Yeah.
I just Googled it. It says suffering is the state of undergoing pain, distress, or hardship. That's it. So is there pain, distress, or hardship associated with growth? Absolutely. But I totally get where you're coming from, that there is also a sense when you say the word suffering of a sense of like helplessness, a sense of foreboding, a sense of everything is outside my control.
And I think maybe where this is coming up for me of suffering and growth is like, this is the cross I have to have. I have been burdened with being a sex addict, and this is what I have to do. And suffering is the price I have to pay. This is my lot in life.
Right.
I have to suffer.
Well, and there also is the partner's experience of suffering of, okay, I'm in a relationship with a sex addict or a porn addict or someone out of control. And that's just my cross to bear and to suffer through. And those are both really scary. I don't know how it ties into that. Chris, I like what you said about suffering and growth. The word that came, a word that came to mind while you were talking for me is growing pains, which we all hear all the time. And I do very much think that it is a state of perspective and a mental shift. I just, in my own personal life, have often pondered on the idea of trials and blessings. And I can say at times I have unequivocally stated to other people, my trials are actually my greatest blessings. Like my trials are actually my greatest, most cherished experiences that I have been through. My blessings of living comfortably, having enough for all of my needs and many of my wants, like all of those blessings are not that dear, and they're not the things that are sacred to me, but the trials, the growth pains that I have gone through very much are some of the most dear, sacred experiences in my life.
Are you guys familiar? Are you guys familiar with Viktor Frankl?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Probably one of the ultimate experts on suffering.
Yep.
You know,
Would agree.
in a concentration camp. And I just looked up a quote of his, and he says, in some way, suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. And so maybe there's a, I think the purpose of maybe this I don't know what the purpose of this conversation is, but I think there's power in the midst of something really difficult, looking for the lesson and looking for the growth opportunity, because you're right, Chris. I think in some ways suffering oftentimes feels meaningless and pointless and empty and like a little trivial.
Yeah.
But if we can find a meaning or a purpose for that suffering, something that we're sacrificing for, a lesson that we're learning, a way that we're growing, the pain is no longer suffering because there's a purpose associated with it. Is that kind of what you're trying to say?
Maybe that's what it is on one hand, you can just resign that you have to suffer and this is what you have to do. But when you find the meaning and the purpose, it can possibly, maybe I'm seeing suffering and growth as companions. Maybe that's the connection I'm trying to make. And that in some parts we find ourselves suffering. Like, this is so hard. I feel helpless. I don't know what I can do, but you keep on keeping on. And then somewhere something comes in and it allows you to evolve. And suddenly the suffering is like, I'm growing. That was that was a rough spot, but look where I am. And that purpose and meaning shifts it from suffering to, that was a lot of growth and really uncomfortable. Does that?
I like that a lot, Chris.
And I think go ahead, Hans. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, I've often wondered about at what points in our show can have deep meaning or value for people. To be a traditional Mormon for a minute, there's a scripture in the Book of Mormon that talks about, for some it's given to know, and for some it's given to believe, and for some it's given to believe on the people that do know. And maybe one of the values that we can have, that I can personally have on this show, I'm myself, if you guys echo it also, amazing, is to be able to say to the people that are listening and following us, the suffering and pain that I went through when it came to discovery of my porn use, and much suffering, personal shame, suffering, guilt, difficulty before that, was very painful. And there is a way to move to a greater sexual health. And I have been really fortunate to feel that. And for people that are listening and struggling and in that crisis, maybe that's what we can say today. Maybe that's the point of this conversation, is to just say, yes, you might be in a crisis. And if you hold on, and if you keep trying, and if you keep being curious, there is a way to move through that, to grow out of it. I have done it myself. Nate, I think you have done the same. Chris and Jake, listening to your stories, you guys did the same. of going through a very difficult place and coming to a place that is more beautiful and more healthy.
Love that.
I will echo that, Hans. I appreciate your vulnerability in going where you needed to go. And I think to extend the hope that there are times when I remember with Jake and me of just feeling like we're just suffering. Like there's nothing we can do. I don't know what to do next. We're just miserable and suffering. And because of what you said of just sticking with it, just continuing on, we were able to grow out of it. And the growth came. And, we didn't grow. We grew slowly. But in hindsight, the growth was actually quite exponential, but we didn't have the perspective.
Yeah.
When I look at where we are now to where we were, that was just because of that commitment to keep with it. But I really like what you're saying there, Hans, and Nate, I think you're bringing this in, is that you can just suffer. Like you can unnecessarily suffer, and you can just sit in and be like, this is my lot. This is just what we have to do.
My life sucks. My marriage sucks. I'm broken. There's something wrong with me. And you can sit in that, or you can get curious.
That's what I was going to say. And that hopefully our show lends the curiosity and to see people stay curious, even if they don't know where to be curious or what to be curious about. Maybe they're curious about what to be curious about. Well,
and that's something that just occurred to me as you were both speaking a moment ago. I think a great place to start is get curious about what you're resisting. If you look at every one of our stories, there's something that we were resisting. And the moment we let ourselves get curious about the thing we're resisting is the moment we started to experience breakthroughs. So one, it would be like, I'm curious to know my partner for who he is. One would be, I'm curious to really fully understand what brings me sexual pleasure. I'm curious to know who I am without the judgments of this is around the thoughts and urges that I have around sexual pleasure. There's things that we try and wall ourselves off from or hide from or avoid confronting because they're deeply uncomfortable. And I think the moment that we start to confront or get curious about the things that we resist the most are the moments, is this the only way? I think is another question a lot of people have.
Yeah.
The whole premise of this show was built on, okay, is the addiction model the only way to approach this problem, or are there other ways?
Yep.
And there are other ways, and we're getting curious about those and exploring them in these conversations. And it's opening up opportunities for amazing conversations between us and between our listeners. And so I would just kind of look at your reality and think about, like, what are the things that I'm certain of, or what are the things that I think are doors that I cannot explore, I cannot look into because they just scare me too much, and then open them up and get curious about what's so scary about them. Like what's the resistance about? Where does that come from? And as we explore those resistances, those things that we want to avoid the most, I think that's where we kind of have these amazing growth experiences. Maybe it's something as simple as like, I need to learn to stand up for myself.
Can I pose some middle ground? Like, speaking as the wife, curious to me. So I'm Kristen, the wife now. That went through this with
not the therapist.
Nope. I don't think I was curious. To me, curious is like proactive and asking questions and asking Jake about this or that. I think after we went through the crisis and we leveled out and I wanted to stick around and he wanted to stick around, I think I had to just start with a willingness to be open. I wasn't totally proactively asking questions, but I wasn't shutting it down. I was just like, I'll listen, I'll read a book, and that wasn't totally curious yet. It was just, I'll stop being so resistant and move to this middle space.
Yeah.
Then my curiosity has kind of been born later, but I think that was my middle ground. So I really like what you're saying, Nate, of being curious about the resistance, and then maybe just look for the invitations of where you can be open or willing to be open. Yeah,
because it's really hard to go head first barreling into some of these paradigms.
I think people sometimes take our word for curiosity as enthusiastic exploration.
It can be a reluctant curiosity.
And I think a lot of people are like, I am not enthusiastically curious about anything. I'm really scared and I'm reluctant, but I want something different.
Yeah.
Chris, that's really cool how you offered that. Just totally honest about. Thanks for being vulnerable and honest about that, because I think that's a great alternate or another way to look at curiosity. I'd offer one of my own tools that was really important for me with curiosity was to set aside or to be willing to just temporarily suspend my faith and my religion and the morals and standards that went along with that. And just ask myself, what am I really feeling? What do I like? What do I not like? What are my desires? What's my sexual impulse like? What are my sexual desires and thoughts like? And to be able to just experience those without putting any immediate judgment on them really started to help me understand what I do like and what I don't like, and where my own personal moral boundaries and floor was. Like, it was really interesting to be like, okay, I'm giving myself permission, curiosity, to look at everything and to just experience myself and experiencing my sexual being. And then it was cool to be able to see, oh yeah, I like this. This is interesting to me. That is not interesting to me. Like it was being curious in that way has also been very helpful and beneficial to me for sure.
Was that, Hans, was that a scary step for you to take to give your, like when you say the word suspend, kind of what you had known, how did you do that? Where did you make space for yourself to do that? What did that look like?
That is a scary space for sure. And when you asked, as you asked that question, my thoughts went back to moving back towards where our conversation started about maybe some intersection of religion and sexual desire. At first it felt like, okay, I'm totally questioning my religious beliefs, and I'm totally questioning my faith, and I'm totally questioning all of the religious construct that I grew up with and that has been part of my life forever. And so that aspect of it was scary to try and approach it, because there is some feeling of that I experienced. And I will say now that I have gone through that process, it has allowed me to be able to reconstruct my faith and my belief in a much more meaningful way, as opposed to just believing what was prescribed to me and what was given to me as the standard. I now can look at those standards, look at that belief system, and I can say, I see the value in this. This is important to me also. I don't 100% agree with this. I'm going to reserve my own personal belief and feeling about this particular topic or area. But it has deepened my spirituality and my faith immensely, because I was willing to take back, I think, or take on, to go back, like you said earlier, go back to that developmental state that some of us never experience when it comes to sexuality and faith. A lot of us, for me, I never went through a very trying, difficult, suffering space of faith. I was given a faith and I jumped into it and I love it and hold it dear, but I did not originally go through that difficult, developmental, challenging space of figuring out my own faith. And now I've had to kind of go through that later in life, and it's been amazing and awesome.
Love that, Hans.
Thanks.
Nate, what's the question you wished you're being asked right now? Because I feel like there's something that you would be asked, you would share it.
I just want to revisit Hans's question early on that we haven't touched on yet about sin.
Yeah.
What is sin?
Yeah.
I have some thoughts on it if you guys want me to dive in, unless you guys want to share something first.
No.
I'd love to hear where your minds.
So I listened to this lecture series. This is where I kind of glommed onto this idea, and then I started studying it and found out that it's really useful. But the Hebrew term for the word sin actually it means to miss the mark. And I was introduced to this through Jordan Peterson's Bible lecture series. But as I've done research, there's a lot of like Bible scholars they agreed that the translation of sin in the Bible means to miss the mark. And I love this idea of missing the mark, because if you think of an archer aiming at a target, they've got their bow and arrow and they're aiming at a target. There's a lot of different ways that you could miss the target. You could miss the mark. You could miss it by inches. You could turn around and shoot the opposite way. You could shoot straight into the air. You could aim at somebody else's target. Or I think maybe in the context of our spirituality, the worst thing that we could do is just not even fire an arrow, and we're still missing the mark by not taking action.
Yeah.
So with that being in mind, I think the most important question for me, just with that definition on the table, the question would be like, what is the mark? What's the target that we're aiming at? And then do our choices make us miss that mark, or do they align with or help us get at least in the proximity of the target that we're aiming for? Like if I feel like the ideal here is, even if you're missing the mark, the ideal scenario would be to at least be making a sincere effort to hit the target. I think that's the ideal way to miss the mark, is to have the right intent behind your efforts.
Yeah.
So if you're going to commit a sin, at least make it a sin worth committing, not some sort of intentional sin, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
I get the essence, I think, of what you're saying. Yeah. And
So I guess the question that I would present to you guys, if we're going to define sin here, especially in the context of the conversation we're having, is what's the mark?
And are we talking sexual sin? Like,
sure. What are we aiming at?
You don't want to ask a therapist that question.
I think maybe where our conversation started with the fact that pornography addiction, out of control sexual behavior is a predominantly or is most prevalent in conservative religious societies. When I think about my youth and growing up and early life, any type of sexual experience in my mind was sin. I mean, it was pretty simple. If you were experiencing some kind of sexual feeling, behavior, pleasure, that was sin.
Yeah.
And I can now sit here and say, I disagree with that.
So you were aiming at the wrong target.
I was aiming at the wrong target.
Making you miserable.
Yeah, the target back then for me was just the only target and the only acceptable target was no sexual behavior of any kind.
Right.
That was
so that's the wrong target. I think we can, at least for the three of us, we could probably agree that the reason you were miserable is you were aiming at the wrong target.
Yeah, I would agree in that sense. Absolutely.
So what's the real target?
The real target now for me, I'll just personally, and I'm just expressing this for the first time and thinking it through for the first time. The real target for me would be to get to know, to understand, and to become clear on what sexual health means for me personally, and how I believe that fits in with my purpose as a being and a human. Which I believe is integral. I think all of us are sexual beings in some manner. I believe sexual pleasure is something that we are meant to experience and is a beautiful thing. And doing it in a way that aligns with, for me lately, doing it in a way that aligns with those things that we've started to define as sexual health, of honesty and non-exploitation and shared values. That's how I have started to experience and learn about what the real mark should be when it comes to sexual pleasure.
I totally agree with that. And I would say, just invite people to get curious. If the mark that you are aiming at is causing people to commit suicide, if it's causing you to disconnect with a part of yourself, to turn off a vital part of what makes you who you are, if it's causing you immense amounts of shame and mental illness, if you feel like you have to keep secrets because if people found out who you were, they would think you were a terrible person and you'd be unworthy of love. If that's the mark you're aiming at, then I'd like to invite you to consider that you might be aiming at the wrong target, and that the target that you've been told is the target your whole life, whether it's by family members or people in your community or people from your religion, they might have been wrong. And I think that's worth considering.
I like your candidness, Nate. I like your ability to speak candidly about that, because a lot of those things you just talked about are terrible burdens for us to be carrying for our society.
And
shifting the mark to reconcile some of those.
And to help you make certain that the suffering that you're encountering along your journey of life is necessary suffering that leads to growth, or that suffering that you transform by giving it a purpose and having it be maybe painful, but it's not suffering anymore. It's pain with purpose.
Yeah.
And not the meaningless suffering that comes from avoiding. And anyway, we could talk forever. Kristen, anything you want to end off with before we wrap up?
I loved ending on that note of the idea and of shifting the mark possibly. And I really love the invitation to, well, I just feel like people should, my final word to be like, rewind the last 4 minutes and hear that again. I'd say, because that sexual development, it's a thing. You can't just skip it over. We have to develop it at some point. That is what is development.
Avoid it at your own peril.
Yeah.
But my time has come to an end.
You have a baby in the room, don't you? A human. Okay. Well, we'll see everybody next week. Thanks, Hans. Thanks, Jake.
Thanks, you too. Great talk.
Bye, guys.